The European View Podcast. Your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal, brought to you by the Martens Centre. With Sara Pini.
Hello, and welcome to the European View Podcast, your way to navigate through the main issues of our policy journal with valuable insights from the authors themselves. I'm Sara Pini, the Assistant Editor-in-Chief of the European View and the Senior Research Officer at the Martens Centre. And today we will keep diving into one of the most pressing issues of our time, which is also the central theme of the latest issue of the European View, the future of transatlantic relations. With us is Garvan Walshe, Chair of UnHack Democracy and the Research Associate at the Martens Centre, whose article tackles what might just be the hottest topic of all, namely a European way of war towards doctrine to defend against Russia without the US. You can find this and all the other articles of the European View on our website, martencentre.eu. So, Garvan, welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon.
It's great to have you with us again. You're basically a recurring guest now. So let's start with the big picture. So what exactly is or should be the European way of war, and how does it stand apart from the approaches taken by the US or by Russia?
So one of the big questions is, how can European militaries fight themselves without the United States? It's still a contingency plan, but we have to see what happens if the United States continues to disengage from Europe, continues either to shift towards Asia or to go back into the American borders and adopt a more isolationist policy. Europe might be left on its own. It might be left without American equipment. Certainly, it might be left without American active involvement in a conflict. And this is just what Vladimir Putin was trying to test when he sent those drones into Poland 2 weeks ago. Were people going to respond? Who was going to respond and why? Fortunately, there were Dutch aircraft backed up by the Italians circulating at the time. They dealt with those drones. But Donald Trump himself was very ambiguous. He sort of said, well, something's going on there. That's not the kind of response you'd expect from what used to be the cornerstone of the transatlantic alliance. Rather, this guy who's thinking, Europe, you can do it. I also think that's the interpretation of his tweet, I think it was yesterday, maybe the day before, saying Ukraine can win this. And it's true, Ukraine with Europe can win this, but we have to work out how. But it's also an indication not only that Trump may not particularly be involved in supporting it, but he thinks that this should be our responsibility. And he's not entirely wrong. It is our continent. Russia has an economy the size of the Netherlands and Belgium. We should be able to do this ourselves. We are 500 million people. We have the most powerful land army in Europe in the Ukrainians. We must remember that. We would never be fighting Russia without Ukraine. We would be fighting Russia with Ukraine, provided we can continue to sustain Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. So when you put all these things together, the question is, what does it mean across the front that stretches from Svalbard in the north all the way down to Varna or Burgas in the south on the Black Sea? We shouldn't just see this as a question of Russia versus Ukraine or Russia versus the Baltic states. The overall Russian interest stretches along the European border, and we need to think about what strengths we have, what weaknesses we have, and what our strategic position is across that whole border. And if we do that, we start to see that we have some geographical advantages as well. Russia is very, very spread out. We're seeing this with the great difficulty Russia has in actually defending its airspace against Ukrainian attacks because it's just so large. We have the advantage of a pretty compact geographical area in which there are lots of people. We have Finland now in NATO and in the European Union. That's physically very close to the Russian heartland. So we're able to create strategic dilemmas for Russia. They need to think, do they continue their efforts in Ukraine, or do they want to protect their northern border from possible NATO or European retaliation? These are the parameters in which any discussion about how we defend against Russia, how we deter Russia. And the way we deter Russia is by threatening it with defeat. And if we can do that, then we have a chance of restoring peace and security on our continent. I can get in a bit more on the sort of more military doctrine kinds of things, if you like, if that's part of your drift of your question.
What is the focus point of the European doctrine as compared, for example, to the US and Russia?
So the Russian doctrine is very centralized. It's still very Soviet. They tried to modernize things a bit, and they made a pale copy of some Western ideas of war at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. They failed. They didn't have armed forces sophisticated enough to be able to do that. And they've reverted to a war of attrition where they send large numbers of men in. These get killed at high cost by the Ukrainians. And then Russia advances extremely slowly. It's betting that it has enough men it can throw into this meat grinder and hopes to exhaust us. This isn't the type of war that suits democracies. It's also not the kind of war that suits technologically advanced powers. In this way, the European way of war is actually quite similar to the American one, in that it's all about speed, communication, and rapid movement as much as we can. We need to use our firepower to confuse and disorient the enemy as well as destroy them. The important thing, as the great European military thinker Clausewitz said, is finding how to defeat the enemy's will, not necessarily destroy all their equipment or personnel, but to defeat their will. And the question then becomes how you defeat their will. You don't defeat their will by simply mounting a static defense, as the French did in 1940. Or as some people have suggested we would need to do against Russia. If we mount a static defense against Russia, we'll probably gradually be pulled back and be demoralized. And this doesn't suit democratic countries. It puts us on the defensive. So this means that if we are going to credibly deter Russia and credibly stand a chance of defeating the Russian military, we need to think about offensive military operations. What do they look like? Where in Russia would we threaten? How do we do that? What kinds of equipment do we have to do that? What kinds of gaps do we have if the Americans go, and how do we fill those gaps? So that we can begin to pose that threat to Russia and its various parts of Russian territory that are near Europe. We always worry, for example, about Kaliningrad, because it's a kind of a Russian outpost in Western territory now. On the other hand, from the Russian perspective, Kaliningrad is a very vulnerable salient, surrounded entirely by Western territory. So let's think about these things from both of their perspectives. The Russians are now worried that there can be NATO or European troops on the border with Karelia and in Finland, very, very close to St. Petersburg. That's something they didn't have to worry about before when Finland was neutral. But now that it's not, now that it's integrated into the Western alliance, this is a flank they have to watch. So we need to think about how we can pose those threats and make decisions difficult for the Russians. They need to know that if there is a conflict with NATO or with the European Union or with Europe in some way, that the European or Western effort could come from a number of different directions. And they need to be very unsure about which direction would actually end up being the decisive one.
And behind this, there's all a different strategic culture. And I would suggest our reader to read the article that you wrote on the previous issue, the Beowulf Group taking the lead to defend Europe. It was also very interesting. But let's move to another point that I also found very interesting, is the analysis of the so-called order of battle, meaning what each side can actually bring to the field. So you identified different possible European coalition, and then you compare them in terms of manpower and equipment to what Russia can bring. Can you briefly sum up this?
So I looked at sort of 3 or 4 different rings. The narrow ring would be a kind of coalition of the willing. And who are the willing realistically? They are the Baltic states, they are Poland, they are Ukraine, they are the Nordic countries, and they're likely to be the UK as well. These are the countries that can be relied on almost regardless of political circumstances to see the Russian threat as extremely serious and feel they have to do something about it. They include Finland, obviously, as well, which is actually pretty decisive because of Finland's strength in artillery. Now, then there's the second group, which is, let's say, these are the people who are currently pretty well disposed to dealing with the Russian threat and aligned with the West, and that's most of the European Union, excluding Hungary and Slovakia. That does include countries like Italy that have used to have a more ambiguous position but are currently very much strong supporters of Ukraine. It includes countries like Spain, despite their relatively low level of military expenditure, do have significant equipment. It doesn't include Greece and Turkey because they have their own strategic competition with each other. And so I took them out of that level of analysis. And finally, there's a broader ring that includes Turkey and Greece, and particularly Turkey, because Turkey brings significant land forces to bear. Some air force, though their air force is a little bit old, but it also brings a lot of strategic geography, because it's on the south of the Black Sea. It provides another way in which forces can be based and be used to attack or threaten Russian territory. So these are different varieties. And one of the surprising conclusions that came out of this is if you just look at the main land platforms and main battle tanks, artillery pieces, it turns out that the inner coalition of the willing actually does match Russia, at least for a defensive operation. This is something that we tended not to focus because we tended to build our militaries differently. The West tends to put its firepower in the air. Soviet militaries tend to put their firepower on land in artillery. But even on artillery and land power, we can match them. We're currently in a bit of a deficit in air power because we're transitioning towards fifth generation fighters, which are basically the F-35s. So a number of countries are in the middle of big orders for their new fighters. Some have now changed. They're no longer ordering F-35s. They've gone for European options because of a change in American positioning under Trump, let us say. So we're seeing increased interest in the Gripen from Sweden Saab, increased interest in the French fighters. And of course, there are several sixth generation fighter programs that the Europeans are also building up. So, however, in this strict air domain, the inner coalition of the willing is a little bit short. So, reinforcing those air forces should be a priority. And we can also talk a bit about drones and other things. A lot of the evolution of the drone battle and a lot of the debate around that happened after this article went to press. But it's important to distinguish between two types of drones. On the one hand are the small, like first-person quadcopter type drones that are being used in land warfare quite a lot, both by Russia and Ukraine, to fight their war of attrition. And in a sense, those drones are functionally a bit like a modern form of artillery, but one that you can guide more, one that you can be a lot more precise with, as long as the weather is good. But then there's also drones, meaning larger platforms that fly next to crewed fighter aircraft. And they would fulfill a role that's similar to fighter jets, just autonomously. Perhaps, you might have, in the future, you might have one, fighter with a human pilot in it, and then 5 or 6 drones being controlled by that one aircraft. And there's both quite a lot of European technology trying to develop that, as well as American and I presume Russian technology. Though the Russians are probably a little bit behind in that sort of stuff, despite the progress they've made on the ground air drones, if you know what I mean, the artillery type drones.
And what about manpower? Because I think your finding there also quite interesting. What models of recruitment and of reserves do you consider to be the most effective? What we actually need?
I think a lot of this depends on the country in question, but also it's the European population is much bigger than the Russians. There's been a lot of talk about reintroducing sort of 1980s, 1990s style conscription. That's probably not needed anywhere except maybe the Baltic states and Finland, where it still continues, because of our overall numerical superiority. In countries that might want to include some kind of military service, something like the Swedish model or the Norwegian model would be very effective. There, it's something that is open to young people, young men and women who graduate from high school. They have an option of doing a year or two of military service, and they're able to fill their quota by volunteers. And this is probably going to be enough to sustain a modern Western type of military, particularly that uses high technology and equipment to compensate for a relative deficit in manpower. This is also where the drone war is very important. Ukraine is able to hold that front with very, very few people because it has a lot of drones. And this means that, the more advanced your soldiers are, the less territory, the more territory each individual soldier can prevent the enemy overrunning. and developing these kind of, this kind of high-tech equipment and the rapid, um, adaptation, updating of that kind of equipment is going to be crucial if we're going to be able to defend ourselves. The Russians are doing a combination, some of this, and they're also doing the opposite. So, on the one hand, they're still sending in their human waves, the meat grinder kind of attacks. On the other hand, they're using the drones in a more modern way. They're using them to make resupply impossible. They're using them to actually, threaten and kill the enemy in a technologically sophisticated way. They are adapting. There are things we can learn from them in that area as well. But I don't think we need mass conscript armies anywhere except probably the Baltic states, and I guess Finland, maybe Poland might need something, but even they would probably be able to reach their manpower requirement, which I think is 350,000 soldiers, with a volunteer scheme like the one that the Nordics have.
I think that was one of the most interesting findings of your article. But let's look ahead. You have all a list of very concrete proposals at the end of your article, but I would like you to focus on the 3 top priorities that Europe should work on the next, let's say, 5 years to make this doctrine credible, and in particular to sell it to our European societies.
So the single most important thing has got to do with suppression of enemy air defense. If we're going to fight in this high-speed way that deliberately tries to confuse the enemy, we need air superiority. And if we're going to get air superiority, we need to be able to destroy their air defense capability. Russia knows this because this has been Western doctrine for about 30, 40 years, that we plan to use our superiority in air power to be able to control the battle space and then disorient and defeat the enemy. So Russia has spent a lot of time developing air defenses, and we need particular types of missiles and equipment to be able to destroy those air defenses. Some of these can be carried by F-35s, but we have relatively few of them. And also, if we're hypothesizing the United States won't necessarily be helping, then we need to think about how we can do this without relying too much on the F-35s, which may be either partially usable or just very, very, carefully protected, because we may not be able to get any more. And that means improving our ability to suppress and destroy enemy air defense. And then once we've done that, we can use our much larger numbers of 4th generation aircraft to continue to degrade and destroy the Russian air defense capability, and then ultimately to attack Russian forces on the ground in any kind of conflict. The second thing that is related to that, of course, is the nuclear question. Russia has a doctrine that involves threatening the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons are essentially smaller nuclear weapons. They're not designed to destroy a city, but they might destroy a military formation or a major battleship or in one go. And Russia at the moment threatens to use them. And certainly if we were engaged in military operations in the outskirts of St. Petersburg, they would definitely threaten to use them. And at the moment, our only counter threat would be from the French and the British nuclear arsenals, and that would involve threatening essentially the destruction of the world. The Russians know that's not credible. So we need to think about how we develop our own tactical nuclear weapons to not really to use, but to counteract the Russian threat. So if we have an equivalent threat, the Americans currently do have these, then we'd be able to say, well, you use yours, we'll use ours. So actually, let's just take all these off the table and continue to fight conventionally. And that would be pretty much required for our doctrine to work. The British program probably can't be adapted to these kinds of weapons because it's heavily specialized in things that can go on intercontinental ballistic missiles launched from submarines. But the French program probably could be adapted, but it would cost a lot of money. The French don't have the money, so the question is who would pay. The answer is probably Germany and Poland in practice. But there would then have to be a lot of discussions over who would have launch authority for these weapons. Would it be the President of France? Would it be some European authority? There's a big question of how a collective entity like the EU can have nuclear deterrence. We certainly don't want to, have Viktor Orban vetoing the use of nuclear deterrence that would remove all credibility from it. So we need to think about those institutional questions and find ways to develop it. The third thing we probably need is, improved signal intelligence capability. A lot of this has relied on the Americans for some time, and we are going to have to invest a lot of money over time in upgrading our capability to be able to achieve something similar. At the moment, we have very good human intelligence capability in Russia, thanks to the Ukrainians. But our signals intelligence is definitely not as good as the Americans.
Thank you, Garvan. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for this very interesting insight on such a vital debate.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
And for those listening in, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and discover all the interesting insights of the European View on our website, martencentre.eu, and on all our social media channels. Thank you, and stay tuned for more.
This was the European View podcast, your place to navigate the insights of our policy journal. Follow the Martens Centre for more.